Have you ever noticed how fascinated children are with secret passwords? I remember 5 years ago, my daughter, who was just 7 at the time, got a diary for Christmas that could only be unlocked with a secret password. But the actual word was not so secret to us because the diary had this voice recognition technology. It would only unlock at the sound of her voice speaking the secret password. The problem was that the voice recognition technology was not very advanced. It was pretty elementary. It didn't work very well, so we could hear her in her room trying to unlock it, repeating the name of our cat 50 times in a row. Mila, Mila, Mila. But kids love secret passwords. Now, adults don't because they can never remember them and so can never access their online accounts. But kids love secret passwords. They'll transform their rooms into clubhouses. They'll build forts in the middle of the living room. And the only way other kids or adults can enter is if they say the secret password. Why the love for passwords? Well, I have a hunch the reason is that they're beginning to understand the power of words. They're starting to understand how certain words can make their parents smile, and yet other words can make their siblings cry. Certain words can make them lose behavioral points in class, and those same exact words can make their classmates laugh on the playground. They're fascinated by the power of their words. The Bible, of course, affirms that words have power. They don't just describe the world, they act upon the world. Proverbs 18:21 says, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue." Death and life. Wedding vows create marriages. Hurtful words destroy them. Kind and honest words can foster friendships. Mean and deceitful words turn those friends into enemies. And of course, then, secret passwords. Passwords unlock new adventures and new worlds, new opportunities. We're in a series right now called Rightly Related, and we've been exploring relationships, our obligations within those relationships, how the gospel can speak to or challenge or empower us in those relationships. And this morning's sermon is titled Conflict and Resolution, but that's a bit of an overpromise, if I'm honest. There are all sorts of things that go into conflict and resolution that we won't be talking about this morning. This morning, I want to focus on a single phrase, a password, if you will. We touched on it last week. We'll be going deeper into it today, and it is, I think, at the very heart of moving from conflict to resolution. But first, would you pray with me? God, we ask that you would speak to us through and in the clutter of our minds and hearts. Pray that you would reorder us this morning. Reorder our priorities. Reorder our loves. May we leave here this morning loving the things you love, hating the things you hate, that we might look more and more like your beautiful Son, Jesus, in whose name we pray. And all God's people said, amen. You know, the problem for the child standing outside the club or fort or clubhouse, desperately wanting to get in, the problem is not saying the password, is it? It's figuring out what the password is to begin with. Figuring out the password is the hard part. Saying it is the easy part, but it's the exact opposite for the phrase that I want to talk about today. It's not a secret. It's not hard to figure out. It's just so difficult to actually say. And yet, if we could say it, surely it would unlock new worlds. Better relationships, better marriages, better friendships, certainly better parent-child relationships. The phrase is not technically magic, but probably closer to having magical properties than any other phrase in the English language. The phrase is this: I am so sorry. I am so sorry. Why is this so hard to say? Why is it even harder to actually mean it when we're saying it? And I wonder, when was the last time you said it? Now, I can think of a couple possible reasons that this is so hard to say. Maybe it's honesty. Maybe it's your commitment to the truth. I mean, to take blame and responsibility for something that's not your fault and saying you're so sorry, I mean, that would be lying in certain circumstances, right? And you were told to always tell the truth. So maybe that's why you don't say, I'm sorry very often. But come on. Yes, it's true that sometimes we will blame ourselves for other people's problems. Children will blame themselves for their parents' divorce. Victims of abuse will sometimes blame themselves for the actions of their abuser. But in most of our everyday conflicts, we do have some part to play, don't we? Of course. In fact, I want you just for a moment to bring to mind your most recent conflict with someone. Can you do that right now? Maybe it happened on the way to church. Maybe it happened last night. What was it? You got it in mind, your most recent conflict. Some of you are cheating and you're not thinking about it. I'm going to wait an extra second. Think about that conflict. Now, if we considered it in mathematical terms, what percentage of that conflict was your fault? 50%? 20%? 10%? Maybe it's still too high. Let's say 2%. Can we go with that? 2%. Let's go with 2%. That leaves 98% of the fault with that other person. So here's my question. Who's responsible for that 2%? In his book, Resolving Everyday Conflict, author Ken Sande says, quote, "You may be responsible for just 2% of a conflict, but you are 100% responsible for that 2%. Well, here's another possible reason we don't say these words. Maybe it's not our commitment to truth. Maybe it's our commitment to love. Like out of care for the other person, we don't say we're sorry. I mean, if we say we're sorry, aren't we letting that other person off the hook and then they won't take responsibility for what they've done? I mean, if we take responsibility for our role in the conflict, it will only confirm their delusion that they had no fault at all. So out of love and concern for the soul of the other person, we cannot let that happen. But of course, here's the reality. That other person, even the 198% at fault, was never on your hook in the first place. That other person that you're in conflict with is free. You know this. You can't make them acknowledge their own 98%. They will or they won't, based on their own decision. You have no control over that. You are powerless in that regard, nor are you responsible for it. Remember, you are responsible for just 2%, not their 98%. You know, the real issue is not our honesty and our love. The real issue is that we don't want to own our 2%, do we? There is something within us that deeply resists owning our part of the problem. I mean, consider all the fake apologies we use in the midst of everyday conflicts. These are actually ways that we avoid having to say we're sorry and owning our 2%. For instance, can we just forget about it and move on? You ever said that before? Here's my translation of it. I have an idea. Let's pretend nothing happened. Or how about this one? I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings. Why the word if? Here's the translation. If there was a possible world in which I hurt your feelings, I'd be sorry. Of course, I don't concede such a world exists. Here's another one. I'm sorry if your feelings were hurt. Translation. I do not concede your feelings were hurt, but if they were, I have no idea who hurt them. How about this one? I'm sorry for what I did, but you... Here's the translation. I am saddened by this situation for which you are the sole and direct cause. How about this one? I'm sorry for what I did, but my boss, teacher, kids. Translation, I'm saddened by this situation for which someone else is the sole and direct cause. And finally, well, you know I'm not perfect. Translation, the cause of your hurt is your expectations. Shame on you, you should know better. Ever caught yourself using one of these? You know, it's not just that these are bad apologies. They aren't apologies at all. all of these are an evasion of responsibility. You're either refusing to admit something wrong was ever done, feelings were ever hurt, or you're shifting the blame of that wrong onto someone else. So what's going on? Why is it so hard to say I'm sorry? These words that clearly we know make for peace. These words that move towards resolution. This not so secret password that helps resolve everyday conflict. Why is it so hard to own our 2%? Well, I want to show you this morning what I think is at the very root of the issue. And to do this, I want to take you to one of the most relationally focused books in the entire Bible. Just as relationally focused as the Song of Songs and Leviticus, which we've looked at the past 2 weeks were. Anyone want to guess what this third book in the Bible is that is so relationally focused? You guessed it, the book of Exodus. Let me show you what I mean. Exodus 40, starting in verse 16. Moses did everything just as the Lord had commanded him. In the first month in the second year, on the first day of the month, the tabernacle was set up. Moses set up the tabernacle, he laid its bases, set up its frames, and put in its poles, raised up its pillars. He spread the tent over the tabernacle and put the covering of the tent over it, as the Lord had commanded Moses. He took the covenant and put it into the ark and put the poles in the ark and set the mercy seat above the ark. And he brought the ark into the tabernacle, set up the curtain for screened the ark of the covenant as the Lord had commanded Moses. He put the table in the tent of meeting on the north side of the tabernacle, outside the curtain, and he set the bread in order on it before the Lord, as the Lord had commanded Moses. He put the lampstand in the tent of meeting, opposite the table on the south side of the tabernacle, and set up the lamps before the Lord, as the Lord had commanded Moses. He put the golden altar in the tent of meeting before the curtain and offered fragrant incense on it, as the Lord had commanded Moses. He also put in place the screen for the entrance of the tabernacle. He set up the court around the tabernacle and the altar and put up the screen at the gate of the court. So Moses finished the work. You know, some of you think that I do this just to torture you. And you're right, I do it just to torture you. In fact, I did the same thing if you were here last week with the book of Leviticus. It reminds me of this time I was in at a conference, and this Old Testament scholar read some really long passage. It might have been from Leviticus, and we're all just like, what is going on? And he just looks at us and said, now I just took all the time to read that to you because someone took all that time to write it for you. And that was it. We just moved on with the conference. But it's always stuck with me that we have a hard time reading this stuff. But imagine if you were the person actually writing this stuff. Anyways, I need a few minutes or so to help you understand this passage and understand why it's connected to the root issue of our difficulty in saying we're sorry. Let me give you some context for the passage I just showed you and how it's all about relationship, specifically relationship with God. You have to understand how this passage functions within the book of Exodus. Here's an overview. The first 15 chapters of Exodus narrate God bringing the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. And the reason God brought the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt was not just for their freedom, it says in Exodus, but so they might go out into the desert and worship him, it says. So they might be in intimate relationship with him, to trust him and obey him. And then after they're rescued, they make their way to Mount Sinai in chapter 16 through 18. And then Mount Sinai marks a new beginning in their relationship. In fact, I like to see or picture chapter 19 like a wedding ceremony. Through Moses, Israel through Moses ascends the altar, and God asks them, do you want to go through with this? Will you be mine forever? And Israel responds, we do. We will, they say on that altar. And then in chapters 20 through 24, God gives them instructions, including 10 very important ones. And these instructions, especially the 10 foundational ones, are not just rules and regulations. They are agreed upon boundaries in the relationship. If this marriage is going to work, there have to be agreed upon practices and habits and boundaries. No other gods before me. Only work 6 days. One day we rest and enjoy each other. Treat each other with dignity. Don't murder. Don't steal from each other. That's chapters 20 through 24. And then in chapters 25 through 31, God gives them instructions for their first home together. This beautiful home called the tabernacle, where the newlywed couple, God and his people, will move in together. Now, I will admit these instructions for the tabernacle are really, really boring. In fact, they read very similarly to what I read to you a moment ago, except a whole lot longer, 6 whole chapters or 7 chapters worth. It's a real slog. Think about this, though. Have you ever had friends designing and building their dream home? You know how it goes. You come over, you're hanging out, they're talking about their home, and then at some point they pull out the blueprints and they're showing you, and you're trying to figure things out, and you look at them and say, oh, okay, yeah, there's the sink. And you say, oh, okay, yeah, okay, yes, I see where the washing machine and the dryer are going to go. Oh, wow, that's a pretty good-sized pantry. And you fake interest and excitement, don't you? Of course you do. But you see, the couple designing and building the home have a completely different attachment to and experience of those same blueprints. Why? Because they're imagining their future in it, aren't they? They're imagining what their life is going to be like. This is their dream home, after all. And in the planning stages, they are visualizing how their life will be in this new place and how their kids are going to grow up in it. We might feign or fake interest and excitement in reading these chapters, but that's because it's not for us. For Israel, this represents their future home with God. And so then finally, in chapters 35 through 40 in Exodus, we learn that Israel builds the home exactly as God designed it. And the passage I read to you relates the last finishing touches, the final arrangement of furniture as they're moving in the furniture in this dream home for the newlywed couple. And as the book of Exodus then draws to a close, it says this finally in verse 34, the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. God moved in. What a wonderful ending to the book of Exodus. Except one thing. One complication. I skipped 3 chapters. Do you notice that? Between the design of the tabernacle in 25 through 31 and the completion of the tabernacle in 35 through 40, something happened. Something terrible happened. While Moses was at the top of the mountain receiving the instructions, Israel was down below crafting and then worshiping a golden calf. They couldn't deal with God's felt absence, even for just 40 days. They needed something closer. They needed something they could hold, something present to them in hand that they could pour their affection and their worship onto. And God was furious. I mean, they'd barely been married. They hadn't even moved in together yet. And already Israel was caught cheating on him. And so Moses rushed in and he pled and he begged and through Moses' intercession, chapters 35 through 40, it still happened. The home was built and God moved in after all. And so Exodus closes with this marriage between God and Israel as hopeful, but also very awkward and confusing, because here's the question. Can a holy God really take up residence with an unholy and sinful people? Like, how is this home, how is this marriage, how is this family ever going to work? How can a just and merciful and kind and truthful and powerful God take up residence with sinful and broken people? God, here's the thing, God can't cozy up to sin. Why? Because it's a logical impossibility. Sin, by definition, is rejection of God, a rejection of one or more of his attributes, a rejection of his justice, a rejection of his mercy, a rejection of his love or his goodness. Whether he'd like to or not, God just cannot embrace a rejection of himself. Does that make sense? Holiness cannot coexist with sin. And so Israel and their home, by extension, has a problem, a major problem. It's the place God intends to dwell. It's their dream home, after all. But it's not fit for his presence. It's not right. It's not okay. It's unclean. It's unfit for God to take up residence in. And you all have done so well in paying attention, because here's the point. Friends, the situation of the tabernacle and the people of Israel is the situation of every single one of us. We were made for relationship with God. We bear his image, after all. We long to be reconnected with him, and yet we're just not fit, are we? Don't take my word for it. Don't even take the Bible's word for it. If you don't believe the Bible or Christianity is true, just take your own word for it. Do you or do you not feel off in this world? Out of place, perhaps. Not quite right. Maybe even unclean. Everyone feels it. And everyone knows it, and everyone devotes their entire lives to try to fix the situation. This is a bold statement, I know, but just try it on for size. The singular life project for us humans is to try to fix that very situation, to try to make ourselves fit for God to take up residence with, whether we believe he exists or not. It's our life's singular project. And there's a term for this project. You know what it is? It's self-justification. That's the term. Self-justification. Self-justification is the project of justifying yourself to other people, to yourself, and ultimately to God. It is the project of proving to everyone, God included, that you're okay, that ultimately you are fit for God to take up residence with. How do we self-justify? Oh, we are endlessly creative. We practice our piety to be seen by others, as Jesus points out in Matthew chapter 6. We perform good works to get recognition. We compare ourselves to other people. We judge, we condemn, as Jesus then points out in Matthew 7. Maybe if I point out the speck in someone else's eye, no one will notice the plank in my own. All judgmentalism comes from a heart trying to justify itself. Because if the spotlight is shining brightly enough on the problems of other people, well, maybe it won't shine so brightly on us. You know what else we do? And this finally connects to our original topic. We evade responsibility by downplaying our part and shifting the blame. We refuse to own just 2%. When there's a conflict, when someone comes to us and says, you really hurt me in that moment, we feel it. A spotlight is shining on us. We feel it, we know it, and when masking ourselves with good works won't suffice. When shifting the spotlight onto other people, those people that are worse than us, won't work. We stand underneath that spotlight, and with a straight face, we do as best as we can to say, it's not my fault. I'm clean. I'm good to go. Can we just forget about it and move on? I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings. I'm sorry if your feelings were hurt. I'm sorry for what I did, but you. I'm sorry for what I did, but my boss, teacher, kids. Well, I'm not perfect. The reason saying we're sorry is so difficult is because it contradicts the singular project of our lives. To say I'm sorry is to admit, when the spotlight is shining down on me, that yes, I have spots, I am unclean, I am not fit for God to take up residence with. Something is wrong with me. So what do? We see, as soon as the book of Exodus closes, the book of Leviticus opens up. And in the book of Leviticus, we see God dealing with this very situation. There's nothing that Israel on its own can do to correct this situation. They cannot make themselves or their home fit for God's presence. They cannot self-justify. They can't make the marriage work. But what God does is he makes provision. The Israelites were told were to take the blood of animals being sacrificed, and they were to sprinkle that blood, or at least the high priest or the priest would sprinkle that blood around the tabernacle. See, blood was understood to be like a sacred soap, a sacred detergent. Why or how, we don't exactly understand. Maybe it has to do with the sheer value of the substance. There is nothing more valuable for a creature than its blood. A person can have all the gold in the world, but if she hasn't blood, she's a decaying corpse. She doesn't have anything. At the cost of its very life is blood procured. So maybe the sheer value has something to do with it. Well, regardless, the blood was taken. It was dabbed on the altar, sprinkled on the furniture in the home, and once a year was taken then into the holiest place by the high priest and sprinkled onto the mercy seat, the very place where God was said to symbolically dwell or sit. And that blood made the tabernacle new. It made it as good as new, clean, okay, right, fit for God's presence, justified. There was nothing Israel could do to make themselves right, but outside provision was made, the blood of a spotless animal, perfect and without blemish. Now, it is true that the sacrificial system is difficult for us to understand. But what is obscured and hinted at and foreshadowed in Leviticus is revealed and made clearer to us in the New Testament. At the cost of Jesus' life, blood was procured, blood that cleanses, makes new, and justifies. The book of Hebrews goes into detail about all this, how Jesus makes us fit for God to take up residence with. Hebrews 4, verse 12 says this, "Indeed, the word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing until it divides soul from spirit, joints from marrow. It is able to judge the thoughts and intentions of the heart. And before him no creature is hidden, but all are naked and laid bare to the eyes of the one to whom we must render an account." Wow. In other words, what he's saying is, in case you were wondering, the spotlight indeed is shining down on you, isn't it? There is no hiding. Masks won't do. But that's not all it says, because it continues in the very next verse. "Since then, we have a great high priest who's passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast to our confession. For we don't have a high priest unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. We have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore approach the throne of grace with boldness so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." And then just a few chapters later in Hebrews 9:24, we find out Jesus is not just the high priest, he's also the sacrifice. It says, "For Christ did not enter a sanctuary or tabernacle made by human hands, a mere copy of the true one. He entered into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself again and again as the high priest enters the holy place year after year with blood not his own. For then he would have had to suffer again and again since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the age to remove sin by the sacrifice of himself." In case you checked out, Paul sums that all up in Romans chapter 5, verse 9. You heard this read earlier. You were justified by his blood. You were justified by his blood. You're fit. You're all right. You're okay. You have nothing to prove. In fact, you can take up a new life project now. You can take up a new project for your life because you're free from that burden. You don't have to come out right in every conflict. You don't have to come out justified in every conflict because the jury is not still out deliberating on whether you are fit for God to take up residence with. The verdict on you, church, is already in. And God declares over your life in Jesus, you are right, you are fit, you are clean, you are justified. And with that confidence that comes from believing those words and that declaration, finally, without fear, without anything to prove, without anything to lose, we can finally say, I am so sorry. And we can own our 2%. I want to give you a moment just to reflect on that. If I can have the worship team come back up here. Maybe it's the most recent conflict that you brought to mind earlier when we began. The one that happened on the way here to church, or last night, or this weekend. Or maybe it's just some ongoing, sort of lingering conflict that you've been in with somebody close to you. But I want you just to take that and hold it before God in this time of reflective silence. I'll give you a minute or so just to hold it before God. And if you do that and you start thinking about it, the project of self-justification will start rearing its ugly head, right? Start thinking about the things that they've done to us to hurt us, right? We focus on their 98% to avoid our 2%. We know every time we bring these conflicts to mind, we feel all sorts of things, and one of those feelings is the need to justify ourselves. I ask that you would just hold that conflict up before God in this silent moment and just ask, God, what do you want me to own? What do you want me to own? In what way can I say, I am so sorry? You know, I say that the phrase, I'm so sorry, is kind of like a magical password unlocking, new possibilities in relationships. And I really do believe that. But of course, you all know that sometimes you can say, I'm so sorry, and you can really own you're part of a conflict. And the other person can say, I don't care. I don't receive your ownership of it. And the conflict remains unresolved. And I was just reflecting on something, though, in our relationship with God. The piece of furniture, like where God sat, his favorite chair or something like that, if I can use that home analogy with the tabernacle, is a seat called what? Mercy seat. Like, isn't that so beautiful? Like, if there was a favorite chair that you knew God was there, right? Like his presence was just concentrated there. It was the seat known by the word mercy. What a relief it is to know that the God we've broken faith with over and over and over again sits on mercy, is characterized by mercy and wants to provide a way for us to continue relationship with him, that we might be fit for his presence. It's one of the reasons why we take this every single week. I know some people wonder, like, why do we take communion every week? It's because this matters more than anything I just said. What this says matters more than like tips on apologies. This is our life. This is what makes us possible. It's what makes life with God possible, is what Jesus did on our behalf. That's why I don't have any other shtick. I don't have any other like stories. Like, this is our story that we rehearse week after week after week when we come together and we say, we are so glad that where you sit is mercy and you have made provision.